Books that make you understand how to study ancient black history. I am often asked by viewers of my videos to do a video on my books so that they can find out more about many of the books that I've written on ancient black and African history. And what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to try to discuss some of these books and show you how you can use these books to really explore in detail various aspects of ancient black history. Books that make you understand how to study ancient black history. The answer is simple. We study it because it explains what we were and what we can do to make the world better today. Amos Wilson in The Falsification of African Consciousness, Eurocentric History, Psychiatry, and the Politics of White Supremacy, discuss how the lack of real awareness of black history can cause mental problems among Afro-Americans. Wilson wrote that when we permit another people to name and define, we permit another people to gain dominion and control over us. Dr. Wilson adds that we must recognize the intimate relationship between culture, history, and personality. If we do not know our history, then we do not know our personality. This led Dr. Wilson to declare, history is used to intimidate African people and make them feel inferior and cultureless. This makes it clear that we should learn more about ancient black history, but among most Afro-Americans, they could care less. If you try to talk to them about ancient history, they always talk about, hey, what's going on now? How can we get along with ourselves today? Why do we have to know about ancient history? All we need to know about is today, and knowing ancient history doesn't help us. But as you can see, Dr. Amos Wilson has brought the fact that knowing ancient history can help you to have more confidence, and that the lack of knowledge about history can cause us mental problems. Many people of African descent are separated from their true history because they fail to realize that Eurocentrists write history to maintain the status quo. Today, this purpose is white supremacy. Dr. Wilson maintains that, and I quote, the European right of history is in tandem with everything else European, and its purpose is ultimately the same, to maintain European power and domination. Knowing your history will reinvigorate your mind and spirit. Europeans are against Afrocentrism because it teaches historical truths, while consensus history sustains white supremacy. Amos Wilson in The Falsification of African Consciousness, Eurocentric History, Psychiatry, and the Politics of White Supremacy believes that the African spirit and mind can be healed through the advancement of African-centered historiographic, social, and natural sciences. Wilson wrote, and I quote, apparently the rewriting, the distortion, and the stealing of our history must serve vital economic, political, and social functions for the European, or else he would not bother and try so hard to keep our history away from us and to distort it in our own minds. I'll read that again. Apparently, the rewriting, the distortion, and the stealing of our history must serve vital economic, political, and social functions for the European, or else he would not bother and try so hard to keep our history away from us and distort it in our own minds, unquote. To Wilson, we should see history as psychohistory. Since the aim of writing black people out of history is to destroy any sense of intellectual social self-esteem for African people. Wilson noted that in the final analysis, European history's principal function is to first separate us from ourselves and separate us from the reality of the world, to separate us from the reality of our history, and to separate us from its ramifications, unquote. Wilson maintains we must study Afrocentric history because Europeans use history as a way of maintaining white supremacy, and the study of history by blacks is a threat to the status quo. Some people believe that writing history is neutral. Writing history is not neutral. Michael Parenti, in History as Mystery, believes that history is not neutral. In his opinion, history is written by the ruling class to solidify their position. Parenti observed that, and I quote, much written history is an ideological safe commodity. It might best be called mainstream history, orthodox history, conventional history, and even ruling class history, because it presents the dominant perspective of the affluent people who preside over the major institutions of society. Parenti supports Wilson's view on the impact of Eurocentrism on education when he noted that many history and political science programs offered in middle and higher education rest on a Eurocentric bias, unquote. As a result, Parenti argues that we learn that disinformational history, which represents the views of the ruling class rather than real history. As a result, Parenti claims that we have consensus history textbooks that teach history from a distorted base. The comments of Wilson and Parenti make it clear that history is not written from a neutral perspective. It is written by historians who define what history is or is not. This means that due to dosha, the personality and preconceptions of the historian determine how he or she writes history. As a result, we find that establishment historians usually write history which supports the dominant view of the ruling class, which primarily supports institutions of higher learning through well-founded endowments. The allegiance of a particular historian to a class or association means that when the historian identifies, selects, and interprets facts, and the framework used to appraise the facts will be guided by the truths accepted by that association or social class. This is why Jacques Villeneuve, in History and the University, the Black Athena Controversy, and the Responsibilities of American Intellectuals, observed that, and I quote, "How can a social scientist, a historian, a literary criticism, etc. claim that his or her conclusions are in any way true, when it is so abundantly clear that these conclusions are inextricably bound with the social and political context in which he or she works and lives?" That's right, unquote. It is true that when we write history, history is always written from the perspective of the individual. History is not neutral. History is not something that just is manufactured as a way to just be true about every people and every group. History is written from the perspective of the historian, or for that social class who pays the money to support those historians at the institutions of higher learning. Since history is written from the perspective of the person writing history, an Afrocentric scholar's work should be respected just as much as the writings of a Eurocentric or establishment historian, but this is not the case. This is why both Eurocentric and so-called liberal historians will usually agree that blacks lack any type of ancient history or association with Egyptian history or Minoan history or the Olmecs. Both the liberals, Eurocentrists, all agree, because both groups do not believe that blacks have an ancient history due to their absorption of consensus history. Consistent history that denies any role of blacks in ancient history except as Ethiopian or Nubian slaves among the Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, or Afro-American slaves and African slaves among Europeans today. Afrocentric researchers correct this myth by writing about the history of blacks in ancient time. The best way to maintain this domination over blacks is to encourage Afro-American people to concentrate on slavery in the West African kingdoms, because this period relates to the expansion of the European. Yes, whenever you write about slavery or the West African kingdoms, you're talking about the European expansion, because it was during slavery and the latter part of the West African kingdoms that Europeans began to dominate the world. If you read official history texts, except for the kingdoms of Meroe, blacks did not have any great civilization until the rise of the West African kingdoms and the Muslim domination of the Indian Ocean. Afro-Americans are encouraged to study this period because it corresponds to the period when the Europeans began to expand. This fits in with the myth that Europeans have always ruled the world. This is a myth. Black Muslims in Spain and Portugal ruled much of these countries until 1492. Yes! Much of Western Europe was ruled by black Muslims for over 700 to 1,000 years. And that these blacks were not forced out of most of Western Europe until 1492. In addition, Africa did not come under the domination of European powers until 1899. And for a considerable period after this date, European powers were trying to militarily pacify Africa. So in other words, the Europeans, during the carving up of Africa, took over African countries beginning in 1899. But by 1960, within a little over 61 years, many African countries had become independent. But the problem is that although these African countries had become independent, many of the people in those countries had been brainwashed and began to believe that Europeans were superior and they were inferior. Although Europeans were not ruling much of the world until the 20th century, history text makes it appear that this hegemony existed much earlier. It is this myth-making done through the writings of history by Europeans that encouraged feelings of inferiority among many people of African descent. To fight this myth and create an intact mental structure that promotes positive attributions within African people demands that you accurately study your history from an Afrocentric perspective. How we began the study of African history and what we need to study is important. The discussion makes it clear that even though each person has had a different experience coming around to learning about African history, it has always been an experience in which the learner had to go out of his way to gain knowledge of the subject. Since books are easy to come by, we usually have a very good knowledge of the big picture, i.e. the Kingdom of Mali, the Ghana empires, but we know almost nothing about the cultures and civilizations that led up to these great ancient black civilizations, like Sumer and Elam. This results from the fact that most of this knowledge base is found in articles. That's right. Much of the research that tells you about ancient history of Africa and black people is found in articles, not in books. Until I wrote my books, that is. And as a result, unless you do the research and read articles from this or that publication, you're not going to know too much about the ancient history of black African people around the world. In the 1970s, it was easy to find this material because there were so few publications to read. Now when I go to the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago to keep up with the literature, just in the field of ancient history, I am overwhelmed by the literature sources. There's hundreds of books, hundreds of magazines published each year about ancient civilizations, much of it leading nowhere because of the Eurocentric nature. Doxic assumptions made by many authors of these works, which were published to support the status quo view of history. As a result, to truly benefit from this body of literature, you need a frame of reference. People like to study Egypt because DI provides this frame of reference. To study other aspects of African history is hard for most people because they don't have the background to interpret the material. That's why I wrote these books. I wrote these books so that just as we can find a perspective on Egyptian civilization, when you read my books, you're going to understand how and why black people build civilizations in Eurasia, why black people build civilizations in ancient America, because of the fact I provide this framework. As a result, to truly benefit from this body of literature, you need a frame of reference. This is further complicated by the fact that many English-speaking Africans are so brainwashed that they have failed to seriously research their history as opposed to the French-speaking Africans. And as a result, Eurocentric dogmas continue to dominate interpretation of history in English-speaking West Africa. I will never forget how in 1985 I wrote a 3-volume world history of black people for Ahmed Patel, a Nigerian publisher, which Nigerian historians refused to support because they could not believe we had such a history. Subsequently, Patel got so mad at me, he refused to publish a book or give me the proofs of the so I could publish it myself. Just think about that. This was West Africans. These were African scholars who refused to accept any identification with any type of ancient history unless it comes from the European. If it's not from the European, they don't want to read it. They don't want to see it. And in many cases, the same thing is true for Afro-Americans. They are waiting for Europeans to save them, Europeans to write their history. It ain't going to be done. I can tell you that. This incident made it clear to me that writing about African history is a priority. But if we wait for English-speaking Africans, especially Nigerians, to do this, it will never happen because the Academy in English-speaking Africa is so gutless. In the 1980s, new books were published relating to Afrocentric studies. Except for the Journal of African Civilization, JAC, these articles and books were mainly published about ancient Egypt. As a result, we have not had any new published texts on the ancient civilizations created by blacks since the research of John Jackson and J. Rogers. As a result, I have written a number of books to help people interested in learning and teaching others about the ancient black civilizations around the world. Let me tell you a few things about myself. I became interested in black history as a student back at W.E.B High School. My interest in linguistics and ancient languages began back when I was a preteen living on the south side of Chicago. At this time, I lived near a Moorish science temple. At this temple, millions of people spoke Arabic. I often talked to the Moors, and they taught me a little Arabic. This experience had a great effect on me. It taught me that I could learn languages easily. As a result, I decided to learn French in high school. I studied French for 4 years. At W.E.B High School in Chicago, they had one of the first Afro-American history programs in the late 1960s. I enjoyed studying history, so I decided I would be a high school history teacher, specializing in African and Afro-American history. In the fall of 1969, I began studying at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. At the U of I, Urbana, I graduated with both my BA and master's degree in June 1973. Yes, I had a BA and a master's degree, and I only went to summer school once. My master's degree from the U of I was in the social sciences with a minor in linguistics and anthropology. My PhD was in educational psychology from Loyola University, Chicago. I've taught social studies in high school and elementary schools, and education at the university level. As a teacher in the CPS, I wrote social science studies back in the 1990s for Chicago Public Schools and Common Core State social studies standards. I presently have a social studies blog on the World Wide Web where I provide teachers with ideas to teach Common Core social science in the public schools. As an undergraduate student at the U of I took just about every African history course. I earned an unofficial minor in African studies. My history professor was Charles Stewart. Dr. Stewart taught every African history course at the university back in the early 1970s. He specialized in Islamic history. My background in Arabic and French allowed me the ability to read many of the primary documents related to African Islamic history. This also encouraged me to learn more about the Arabic language. As a student at Illinois, I worked for the Student Affairs Department. One of my duties was to organize programs for Afro-American students living in the dorms. One of my major projects was publishing a literary magazine for Afro-American students called Yumbo. In this magazine, I wrote many articles on ancient black history. My most important article was on Africans in ancient America. In this article, I discussed all the evidence of Africans living in America before Columbus came to the New World. It was while writing this article that I became familiar with the work of Leo Weiner, Africa and the Discovery of America. In reading Weiner's Africa and Discovery of America, I was introduced to the Mande influence in Mexico and the possibility that the Olmec introduced writing to the Mexicans, as evidenced by the Tixla statuette. I was especially interested in East African history too, so I minored in Swahili for my master's degree, and I decided I would become a specialist in East African history. I chose this area because of the fact that John Williams in his book, The Man Who Cried I Am, had mentioned the fact that knowledge of Yemeni textual material may allow one to understand why Africans and Chinese share many cultural items and tradition. My master's thesis was titled Zan to Zan, Blacks in the Countries Bordering the Indian Ocean. It was while writing this thesis I began to learn about the Dravidians of India. Having read the work of Anta-Diop and Théophile Obianga in French, I knew the Dravidians and Africans shared cognate cultures and languages. Théophile Obianga even talked about an Indo-African family of languages. After college, I taught high school and wrote articles for a Swahili language magazine. The articles I wrote for Yumbo regarding the pre-Columbian blacks in my master's thesis have been the inspiration behind my interest in ancient scripts. These works led to my interest in the literature of blacks in ancient Asia and the Americas. Later I learned that the Mande-speaking people had created many writing systems. Wangara, the Afro-American scholar who wrote on the ancient civilizations in Mexico, mentioned that the Mande probably left inscriptions in the Americas via the Vaisalabre. Once I saw the Vai script and learned about the Vai tradition that it was invented in ancient times, I studied the Vai script and found that I could use it to read the inscriptions on the Leventis Celts. Yes! It helped me to read the inscriptions on the Leventis Celts that the Olmecs had left at La Venta in Mexico. My linguistic studies indicate to me that the Dravidians, Mandis, Sumerians, and Lamites spoke cognate languages that share a common linguistic connection. Given the fact that the Mandi and Dravidians spoke cognate languages, I hypothesized that the Indus Valley writing might also be deciphered using the phonetic values of the Vai script, but reading the signs in Tamil. This hypothesis was correct, and I deciphered the Indus Valley writing. Since then, I went on to decipher the Proto-Sumerian, Meroitic, and Minoan scripts. In archaeological decipherment of ancient writing systems, I explained how I deciphered the Indus Valley writing, linear, Minoan, Meroitic, and the Olmec language. To conduct Afrocentric historical and anthropological research, I use a genetic model of historical research. I outlined this genetic model in my article called Ancient Afrocentric History and the Genetic Model. This article can be found in Egypt and Greece, edited by Molife Kite Asante and Emma Mazama. Cheikh Anta Diop and W.E.B. Du Bois are the founders of modern Afrocentrism. Diop laid the foundation for the Afrocentric idea in education. Diop has argued that the genetic model can be used to explain the analogy between ancient African civilizations. There are three components of the genetic model. 1. Common physical type. 2. Common cultural patterns. And 3. Genetically related languages. Diop over the years has brought to bear all three of these components to his illumination of Kemetic civilization. I took these components of the genetic model to explore the history of Black and African civilizations around the world. Proficiency in a language other than English helped Africological researchers conduct the normal Africological social science. It was Du Bois and Hanbury's knowledge of German that allowed these Afrocentrists to conduct research into the role of blacks in Egypt and Ethiopia. J. Rogers mastered many languages, including French and German, to prove that blacks inhabited almost every continent on the globe. I had to learn personally Arabic, Chinese, Malinke, Portuguese, Otomi, Mayan, Swahili, Tamil, and Tocharian to conduct my Africological research of blacks in Asia and the Americans. Yes, I had to learn these many languages just to be able to find out about our ancient past so I could get at those sources. So you have to try to learn a foreign language so you'll be able, in a sense, to read the primary material. In the 1960s, due to the rise of independence in the East African country of Tanzania, Swahili became a language used by Africological scientists. Swahili terms were used to explain and define the phenomena associated with Africology. This is one of the reasons that the terms used in the Kwanzaa ceremonies practiced by blacks around Christmas time are Swahili lexical items. Swahili is still used among some Africological researchers, but today Egyptian is recognized as the classical name for Africological research. Diop popularized the idea that Egyptian should be used as a classical language for the study of ancient Africological languages and historical studies. As a result, most of the Africological researchers today concentrate on Egypt and use Egyptian terms to explain the culture and Proto-African languages of African people. I began a reconstruction of Paleo-African languages used by blacks in prehistoric times so that we will know more about the culture and civilization of Proto-Africans. In Before the Ma Confederation, Africa's First Civilization, I talk about the Ma civilization. The Ma civilization existed in the Saharan highlands. In this book, I explain how the people of Ma founded many civilizations, including Egypt and Sumer. In Egyptian language, Niger-Congo speakers, and the Mountains of the Moon, I provide the linguistic evidence that confirms the hypothesis of Cheikh Anta Diop, L. Humberger, M. Delafosse, and that the Niger-Congo speakers and Egyptians had a common origin. In this book, I argue that many Egyptians living in the 22 Sepats of Upper Egypt spoke Niger-Congo languages, including the Bantu, Fulani, and Mandi languages. In my book, The Egyptian Language, Niger-Congo Speakers, and the Mountains of the Moon, I provide the genetic, linguistic, and archaeological evidence related to the diverse Niger-Congo speakers, who made up segments of the Egyptian nation. Readers of this book will learn that the Niger-Congo speakers originated in the highland regions of Middle Africa. the mountains of the moon, and that this population, which later settled Upper Egypt, formerly belonged to the Unanian culture. In my book, The Ancient Black Civilization of Asia, using linguistic, anthropological, and historical evidence, I proved that the earliest cultures of China and Indochina were founded by blacks from West Africa and modern Ethiopia. In support of this history, I have posted over 150 videos on YouTube. In Ancient Black Civilizations of Asia, I make it clear that the earliest Japanese were blacks, and that the Japanese language is related to African language. In addition, I was able to prove that the founders of the Xia and Shang civilizations of ancient China were of African and Dravidian descent. The study of Africana in ancient America has been fruitful. Dr. Leo Weiner, in African Discovery America, was the first to recognize that the ancient civilization of Mexico had been influenced by Africans. He was especially sure that the Mandi-speaking people influenced the religion and civilization of the Aztecs and Mayan people, and that the writing on the Tuxtla statuette was written in the Mandi writing system. Using the findings of Weiner in regards to the writing of the Olmecs, I discovered that the blacks from West Africa left numerous inscriptions written in the Mandi language. I discovered that due to the cognition between the Mandi writing and ancient scripts used by the Minoans in this valley, I could read the Indus Valley writing and linear inscriptions. The study of Africans in ancient America has been fruitful for me. And later I read Ivan Van Sertima's book, and Ida Van Sertima, and They Came Before Columbus, also gave some information on blacks in ancient America. I have written extensively on the African origin of the Olmecs. I deciphered the language the Olmec language, and since then I have published numerous articles and websites where I discuss the Olmec kings and their civilization. My most important work on the Olmecs is Atlantis and Mexico. In this book, I provided a detailed account of the migration of the Mandi-speaking people from Africa to America. I explained that they call themselves She, or Sea people, and provided informative discussion of the Mexican tradition regarding the expansion of the Olmec from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific coast of Mexico. Also in Atlantis and Mexico, what I've been able to do is I illustrate how the calendar used by the ancient Mexicans was basically based on the Mandi calendar that exists in Africa and traditional African societies today. In many African societies, this calendar has been replaced, but for the most part, the calendar used in the Americas was a calendar first invented and used in Africa. Atlantis and Mexico will provide any research with a wealth of knowledge to understand the African origins of the Olmec and the contributions of the She to the civilizations of Mexico. I've expanded knowledge about the other blacks who established colonies in the Americas before Europeans. In African empires in ancient America, I discuss the Exumite, mound builders, and other ancient black Americans. I've written 2 books that provide history on the various civilizations in Africa. In Ancient African History Primer, I explain the various ancient civilizations that formerly existed in ancient Africa. The primer's prose is readable and provides definitions and terms explaining these cultures. I've also written a short history of black people in ancient America. This book provides a 60,000-year history of black people, including a discussion of the genetic unity of black people in Africa and Americas and Eurasia. So my short history of blacks in ancient times is a book that will provide you with very important information about all aspects of the various black civilizations in a brief manner, so that it gets right to the point. It also has a fine index. I use linguistic knowledge to decipher the Olmec, Meroitic, and Minoan writing systems. I give a detailed explanation of how I deciphered these writing systems, especially Meroitic, in my book, Meroitic Writing and Literature. My most important works is Ancient Africans in Asia, and Afrocentrism Mythoscience. In Afrocentrism Mythoscience, I've been able to update the literature regarding African civilization, Asia, Europe, and the Americas. In chapters on the structure of the Afrocentric curriculum and Afrocentric historical methods, you can learn the history of Afrocentrism and methods that can be used to conduct research into Afrocentric studies. The text in Afrocentrism Mental Science provides the blueprint necessary for students to understand why the Afrocentric model of history continues to find support from the archaeological, linguistic, and anthropological fields of study, and how we can expand knowledge about these areas. This book, Afrocentrism Mental Science, allows you to understand the context in which you have to really look at material so that you can really find ample fruit, even from publications today, that outline and detail the origins of many civilizations based upon the African character. My most recent book is The Phylogeography of Afro-Americans and Africans. This book outlines the population genetics of African and Black people. Today, genetics research is used to support population migration. I have begun to publish numerous articles on the genetic history of Black and African people, illustrating the reality that haplogroups M and Y chromosome are of African origin. In addition to writing books on ancient history, I've also written books on the history of Afro-Americans and the indigenous population of North America. These books can provide you with detailed information on the history of Afro-Americans. I hope you will purchase one of my books to further your knowledge about African and Black history.